You're listening to episode 721 of a Very Spatial Podcast, September 4th, 2023. Hello and welcome to a Very Spatial Podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb. And this is Frank.
And we'll kick off this week with GLONASS. Has, a new member in its constellation. So Russia launched GLONASS K2 number 13. And it just means that GLONASS is a little bit more relevant again. I think they're a complete system now. Does anybody else remember whether or not it's a complete system at this point again?
I believe they are.
Okay.
I'm kind of curious. This is going to get into geopolitics a little bit, and I don't have any answer for it. But one of the key fears has always been about GPS and presumably GLONASS, is that in the event of military conflict, it can be turned off or on. And I'm kind of curious. I wonder if the Ukraine can use GLONASS right now. Because it feels like if anyone were ever going to suffer from that, that would be something that would happen right now.
And the question is, given who they're getting arms from, are they more likely to use GLONASS or GPS? Or Galileo, though it's not a complete station yet. Station?
System.
Sorry. They can turn on select availability and turn off the general use band.
I think you're right. I think they would probably... what I'm wondering is, at this point, if it matters, as I guess what I'm getting at is that does that Russia would go, no, you can't use that. Turned it off, and then everyone, I don't care, just use the GPS in there.
Yeah,
it doesn't. It doesn't really matter. I just go use another one. Is kind of what I'm curious about. So it just feels like it's one of those threats or capabilities that are kind of irrelevant, I guess.
Given the cost of a cell phone that can have, there are Android phones that have 3 to 4 different capabilities in terms of receivers, and you just choose which one you want from the software, that one would hope that the contracting officials at whatever military are saying, okay, make sure to put more than one in.
All right. So next up, some more space news. And this, I think, happened right around when we were recording the last episode. So I can't believe, A, I missed it, and B, right, that I wasn't paying attention.
I believe we mentioned in the last episode that it was about to land.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, because I was like, how did I miss this? So, but anyway, India's Chandrayaan-3 successfully landed on the South Pole of the Moon. So we've talked about this periodically, the importance, right, of the idea of getting into space for countries, for consortia, right, that technology to move into the sphere. And the goal of the moon has not lost its luster. And so India is actually the first country to land on the South Pole of the moon. And I believe since then, they've had data coming back from the lander. And so it's been all around a successful mission. And reminder is that, I think that there's a resurgence of this, and there's another news item I'm going to talk about in a minute that relates to this as well. But I guess this is kind of a focus now for some of the future missions, is this part of the moon, and India got there first. So again, amazing. India has had a strong space program, a remote sensing program, and so they built on that to get to this point. But anyway, exciting space stuff. And to be honest, also had some excitement, and I'm interjecting this ourselves. We got to see one of the Starlink launches 2 nights ago. So
yeah, we have the Chandrayaan who landed. We have the Russian that failed, though images of that failed Russian
the Luna
lander
25. Yeah, this kind of sad.
Have been seen. So yeah, it's an interesting time on the moon. And for India specifically, they also launched just yesterday, so the 22nd, or sorry, I don't even know what day it is anymore. The 2nd, I think, of September, they launched a sun satellite, basically a satellite that's going to be doing research trying to understand the sun. So India's launching and landing all over the place.
Yeah.
It's exciting because in the article they talk about the conversation about that this is a resurgence of, both competition in the best sense of everyone finding something new that's inspiring to the world, and it just makes you feel good when you hear about these things happening.
And in related news, Japan will also be launching a mission that will hopefully put its own lander on the moon. So they have developed the SLIM lander, and I can't remember the acronym specifically, but this is a launch that was delayed and now is scheduled to go off on September 7th. So there was a weather delay. And there's actually another satellite, XRIM, so XRIM, that I believe is on this launch as well. But the lunar lander, again, they're looking at some data gathering and testing because Japan is involved in the consortium that is working on the Artemis project, which Frank just mentioned. And so they're hoping that they'll actually be able to contribute some data to that from this mission if it's successful. And I think currently Artemis is planning to get back to the moon by something like, I think it's 2025. And so this is a global effort. And again, it really is highlighting. I was a little surprised when I'm like, wow, everybody's just kind of going for the moon landings, which is cool, which is awesome. And hopefully this launch will be successful and add to what we need to know to successfully get there with the Artemis project.
So 2025 is 2 short years away.
It is.
It's really exciting.
Well, not even to 1.25.
Yeah, I would say at this point, not even 2.
Yeah. Also in related news, you have MIT's Earth Science division who have created a new technique with remote sensing to determine the flow on planets that aren't Earth. So also going along with this would be Mars and Titan. They've looked at a way to measure the move of fluids and sediment to determine the strength of the rivers that were there, determining that they're very much like some of the largest rivers on Earth, like the Mississippi. So it's really, again, another exciting part of exploring, as they're calling it, places not of Earth, because they're going to require different techniques and different methods in order to understand them the way we understand our own planet.
I'm kind of curious exactly how. I mean, there's no way we'll ever know, but it would be interesting to know how accurate this could be. Obviously, the gravity and the air pressure, or not air pressure, but the atmospheric pressures of these faraway planets, you can factor that in. But, I'm curious how much that really impacts flow rates and things like that.
Well, even like the density of the fluid flowing, right? I mean, all kinds of stuff that when you start thinking about it, you're like, wait a minute. Look at all the things that you'd have to calculate to kind of understand this. And yet when you look at images of the surface, you're like, yeah, but we can recognize those patterns. So, we can make the case that the same forces were at work, just really, really different.
Not to mention the how much we know what water eats away at the underlying sediment, right? But like how much does a liquid methane eat away at the underlying sediment, and for how long? All those sort of things. It's a very complicated, interesting problem, which I'm sure they've accounted for at some level in the model, but it is mind-boggling to think it through.
And what's interesting to me is, again, this is another collaborative effort, and we've been talking about questions that have to do with water, and they also worked with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and several other universities. So we are pulling in all our geographic expertise, but other worlds.
Next up, Google announced some new APIs. So for the Google Maps platform. So if you develop with Google Maps and serve them up. So these are environmental data sets. So to help out with that. And I think they had already begun in this space, and I think there was an air quality layer and stuff, but now there are APIs for solar, which helps you look at the solar potential of roofs, air quality API, which pulls in data related to pollutants and visibility and some of those things. And then this is what got me looking at the article, the pollen API, which looks at current pollen information for common allergens. And of course, with climate change and other things coming, so this is how it kind of feeds into sustainability and those types of issues. Allergies have been noticeably worse for a lot of people, I think, and that's because of the pollen, the changing climate and how that impacts the level of pollen in the air and stuff like that. So interestingly, and of course, Google Maps platform, that's kind of the professional end of things, and so. If you work with Google Maps and present web mapping apps that might want to use some of these new APIs, you should definitely check it out.
I can't remember if we talked about the aerial view API, which gives you the chance to basically be a drone or a plane or a helicopter type of view over cities. And then just as Esri's rolling out or about to roll out their 3D tiles, Google is also rolling that out. So moving into preview soon is what it says in the article.
Yes, I mean, lots of stuff. And we had talked previously about some other things that have been coming as well. I haven't checked out the API in a while, so I probably should go back and look at that.
I'm kind of curious why they don't include it. Well, it would be nice if they added in a wind API. I'll call it a wind API, because if you have the interesting bit there about the solar API, if you had a wind API, you would have all the tools you really need to estimate the sort of clean energy type of energy generation for a particular location, which is always a complicated thing and something that a lot of groups are constantly looking for. I know in West Virginia, for example, it's always complicated because of the way that the what is the federal agency? Energy Department. It's not DOE, but it's Energy. And I can't remember the subgroup under DOE that does those things. They publish a data set that has wind quality, but at the resolution they use, it messes up, for example, West Virginia, because if you look on the average wind quality speed for wind turbines, if you compare the valleys to the mountains, it makes a lot of sense that the average would be, it's not that great. But the point is, if you stick them on the top of mountains, it's actually really good. So it would be nice if they had that sort of ability to tap that in there. And I don't really know where they're getting their data from, if this is just national view that they're getting or they're actually calculating it. Anyway, I'm very excited by these APIs, as you can.
Yeah.
And like all of these, they're not the first ones to these APIs. And so, for instance, the Wind API, there are other organizations that do provide that, everything from the generalized stuff you're talking about, that a lot of that comes from the government, to some of the smaller startups that are working to try to make more detailed, higher resolution ones.
But it is neat that it's all on one platform, just because you can just kind of, we know as GIS people, you can pull from all these different data streams, but it is kind of nice for most people to be able to just go, oh, and then add in this and add in that. It's pretty easy.
And finally in the news, not to be left behind, Mapbox has updated some of their capabilities as well, especially in terms of their 3D mapping capabilities. So they have added dynamic lighting, which allows for more nuanced day to night type of light shifts, as well as updating 3D landmarks in their kind of standard data set. So if you're using Mapbox and Mapbox Standard, then both of these are now available.
If you're not a Mapbox user, look into it, because that's a pretty powerful, the world changes significantly between day and night, as we all know. Go to your average city street at noon and at midnight and see if it doesn't feel better in one versus the other. I think that the really interesting bit comes here when they can start adding in much more human movement activity. So what does the city look like as we move towards dusk as opposed to as we move towards dawn? That's going to be pretty cool when we get there. And it's pretty obvious that we're, very close.
Do we want to do a topic, or we?
The last couple news items did make me think of something I wanted to chat about, but I don't know if it's a topic.
Shoot.
Chat.
We'll chat about it.
Well, my question, because I struggle with this myself, is, all right, all of these tools, and so the Mapbox 3D and the mention of the Google immersive 3D tiles, right, is that I still am torn on the movement of platform for increasingly immersive experience, right? Is I see a lot of the tools that are moving it to the streaming online, that kind of data with things like Mapbox. But yet there's still, right, some of the things that are definitely driven by a desktop computer, a PC, or whatever, and then served up on devices that might be tethered to it. And we've had the discussion before, but when I watch the data layer things come out and, announcements get made and stuff, so my actual question is, right, I'm going to have to invest some time into learning some of these tools, right? Because immersive 3D is something I want to do, but I've gone down the route of the high-end computing, desktop-driven, those types of things. And then I see the tools that come out in the mobile, and I'm like, well, who's my user at the end of the day, right? But yet that would be an investment of time to go that route. So it's just an interesting, because I'm still not seeing the case maybe as much as I could for all of the effort into streaming type of immersive 3D yet. Like the use cases for that. And that's just me, right? Because I've invested so much time in the other.
I think that this is we we see this with a lot of innovations, right? Is that I need to make the case for a data bit or a piece of technology. So I have to construct the platform that uses it, and then that becomes its own thing in its own right. So I kind of feel like at some extent that the intent was, let's put out all this spatial data. Let's put all this data, or not even necessarily spatially tagged data, but put out all this data out there. And if I make it, people will use it. And I feel like they weren't really using it exactly. So to some extent, it is a chicken and egg question, but I think that these platforms were constructed to consume these things. And now those platforms have taken a life of their own and are their own existence. And we've kind of got sort of galvanized to particular platform data stream combinations. And so it does read the question of how do I use this stuff without getting locked into the platform itself? Or how do I utilize that platform for the types of things that I'm trying to do?
Okay, I'm going to try to provide some context here. So we have one discussion in the news where we're talking about 3D tiles, we're talking about 3D visualization, and these are largely still large area, being able to pan zoom. The 3D is 3D, but it's not meant to be experienced from the ground level. It's still meant to be experienced either from a top-down or an orthogonal view where you're looking at an angle from above, right? That's what we're talking about with the platforms, Mapbox, Google Maps,
yes, largely
Apple Maps, ArcGIS, scenes, web scenes for the most part, especially global scenes. On the other hand, you're talking about experiential where it's much more about being on the ground, moving through the environment. So your more traditional video game worlds using Unreal, using Unity nowadays to build those type of experiences. Would that be the context of the two things that we're talking about? Yeah, that'd be
the context. But here's where I come in with the discussion part, right? Is that the Google, of course, calls theirs immersive tiles. So now I think what we're trying to, and this is one of those things where we've had these discussions lots of times, but I think it's a thread that has run through this whole generation of this of geospatial, and as we evolve to these different things, right? The 3D tiles thing has the word immersive in front of it. But if I'm still doing top-down view, right? So I think even the terms are evolving and the end goals. And so that's the thing that I'm like,
So I think you're adding a third set. Sorry, Frank.
Okay,
just to finish the contextualization, that you also have the AR capabilities. And those are this bridging between the traditional on-the-ground walking through experience and these massive data sets that have been created from billions of points and point clouds and imagery and all of this. So that's a third piece to this. Sorry, Frank.
Yeah, I think that this is a scalar issue, right? This is what it gets down to, is that we as GIS people don't care. Well, we care what the scale is, but we have no problems going, well, we go to 124,000, we go to 1 to 100K, we can go to 1 to 1200. We can jump around scales, not a big deal, as long as our data supports it, right? And one of the challenges here is that, so that means we could go to 1-to-1. That's something that could happen, a 1-to-1 scale in the math side of things and the theory side of things. But functionally, the reality is that we've got a bunch of this 1-to-1 scale stuff, or even, 2-to-1 or 50-to-1, whatever, you want to do there for an immersion. And we got a bunch of like 1 to 1200 scale stuff. And we actually don't have a lot to jump to link those things. They're very different data sets. They have very different purposes, and they have very different data definitions and all that sort of stuff. And it feels like we should be able to go through all the scales to jump to it, but we really can't, because the data is not putting out for that purposes. And I'm not even sure that using the current data models we're using, even if you went to 1 to 1200 or 1 to 600 or 1 to 50, you'd be able to jump down to that 1-to-1 immersive scale, because it's the immersive part is actually almost a different dimension in some real sense.
They are different conceptualizations for us. We can go from the top down to the ground, but we usually do it in a way like Google Street Maps. We don't generally jump from that overview down to the ground unless we're using the overview as a load screen to then pop us into that environment that we're walking through. So I don't know.
I think it's a good way to contextualize it, but I do think it's and maybe part of it is that the way I see these two sides of the coin, or gradations along the scale, however you want to do it, is that I think my interpretation or my perception, my worldview of them is very much driven by the hardware in which they seem geared to leverage. Right. So, and I may be getting this wrong, and you can certainly correct me, is that it seems a lot of the newer things, right, the Googles, the Mapboxes, those things, while they do work on desktop computing, they really are designed for the streaming mobile platform, right? And it seems that, again, this is because I've been immersed in the other end of it, where it's a fixed physical location for the hardware. The interface with it is, a screen, or to some extent, maybe if you get into the VR world, right, a tethered VR, but still pretty much stationary, no matter how much we keep trying to say we want to change all that. And I think that in the case of, moving to 3D in the mobile, 3D on the internet, right, they're working to do it. And again, maybe the goals remain different. But as I look at these new things, being immersed in the other world, I just wonder how many of these things do I need to feel like I need to know, and could I leverage some of these tools in the world that I'm working in? So that remains my question.
The answer to the last part is yes, you could.
But should I?
I say,
should I continue down the road I'm already on, or should I look at these?
The implicit question there is not could I, should I? And I think that to go back to where you began here, not the whole thing, but just that last bit, is platform, right? And I don't know how relevant those platforms are to most virtual reality. I don't know how relevant those data streams are to most virtual reality platforms.
Mapbox does have a plugin for Unreal and Unity. ArcGIS has a plugin for Unreal and Unity. I think Google Maps, there is something there that allows for pulling their in as well.
Yeah, but I mean, what we're talking about with most of those other platforms is really abstraction, right? Is that we're simplifying information, the complexity of information, and abstracting a little bit to communicate something. That's essentially what a map does at its core, one of its core functionalities. The immersive experiential thing is about not simplifying, not reducing. For the most part. I mean, you can have things where you do that, but there's a game, for example, called Super Hot, which is you're kind of a James Bondy type of guy, and you're just trying to take down bad guys, and they do simplify a lot of the complexities of the world for that purposes. But for the most part, it's about not reducing the complexity down to something. It's keeping it there. So I kind of feel like philosophically, those two approaches are almost at odds per se. Unless you started from the immersive and then worked your way up to the, Google Maps, which would be, I guess, the perfect world, but they didn't do that because they didn't have access to all the one-to-one stuff, which, again, to Jesse's question, do we even need that? Because that's not what Google Maps was trying to do.
And I also think it's a question of robustness in different ways, robustness in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and what you're doing, in that they're not, as robust in meeting those needs, but also robustness in how long is this going to retain its usefulness for what you're doing versus how much time you have to put into learning it and using it.
Is the squeeze worth the juice?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because it's an investment. And so that's there needs to be a way to determine not just, is this going to be useful in what I'm trying to do? Is this going to be robust enough for what I'm trying to do? But is this also going to be something that this iteration doesn't mean that in 6 months or a year, I'm going to have to relearn everything new again because a new iterations come out? And I know that's the nature of the field, but there needs to be ways to determine that. But I might be thinking of that from my own point of view and not from what Sue's experiencing.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why I did it, right? Because we often talk in more general terms on topics about implications of things, but sometimes it is about your specific example, right? And I think that this is a good highlight when I try to make that decision, because as I see things, I can say, well, I can see where this could work in my project, right? And I can visualize what it would look like at the end and how it might help a user. But then I have to say, well, is anybody that looks at my stuff going to actually be sitting at a computer like I'm doing? And I might answer yes. But also increasingly, I look at the user base out around me trying to do everything on their phones, which and this, again, personal fan, a lot of this stuff is not compelling to me on my phone. And so I may be in the very much minority in that I still want to see it on the monitor or you know what I mean? So the interface does matter to me, but maybe not in the same way it does to others who didn't go through a period where they really were tied to just, the computer and the monitor kind of setup. And so that I think probably colors it. But I think you're both right in the sense that at some point you have to say, this is what I'm going to implement in my project. And you will always see something shiny, right? It's hard sometimes to go, anywhere to a conference or a meeting and like, oh my God, look what they did. But to make that call to say, I'm going to change what I'm doing based on this something is hard because you do invest in it. But I have looked, there are things in my own projects that don't necessarily work the way I want them to. And because I have to figure out a way to do it, given the funding, the goals, right, the end product that I have to do. And so, again, as I see these things come out in the news and I think about it, or we see them at conference presentations and stuff, I say, is that one that goes on my list that maybe I do invest the time with? And I'm sure out there in a lot of projects, right, there's that same, for specific detail, I've had multiple people say, why don't you switch your stuff to Unreal Engine? Like, it is very pretty. But the investment, there's nothing wrong with the one I'm using, right? So that's a specific, very, very specific.
In terms of streaming and the things that you started with.
Yes. Well, I mean, for example, using Mapbox tools to create a cityscape, right? So part of what I'm working on involves walking through a suburban area. And so how much of that suburban area do I have to pre-generate, right? Versus I could potentially use a tool that will allow me to do that quickly. And I've looked at, or using City Engine, right, to generate urban environments, and not just those like specific tools, but also what will people be doing when they're using it, right? So that will affect which tools I do.
Let's not. I mean, you barely touched on this, but let's not forget the inherent complication of. You've mentioned, I think, 3 platforms, and by that I mean hardware platforms. So you've got the desktop, the traditional PC, whether it be a laptop or desktop or whatever it may be. You've got virtual reality or 4, I guess, closely related to that is augmented reality. And then you've got the mobile platform, right?
She also mentioned web.
Well, yeah. I mean, so I kind of bundled desktop and web into one, but you're right. They're really, that's, a 5th platform in theory. The underlying hardware and the underlying software development are very different from each other. The way you code for the web using things like JavaScript and CSS and HTML, for the most part, you can use other things, but that's basically it. Connecting to a backend server using something like node.js if you want to stick with JavaScript, or using PHP or Perl or Python or whatever it is. So there's 2 languages, and that's ignoring the CSS, HTML side of things. Then if you go, well, okay, I want this thing so that when you go to a certain state, you just can pick up your phone and start going nuts. Okay, well, for the phone, I've got to learn Android, so that's going to be Java. And if I want to learn iPhone, because some people are going to have the iPhone and some people are going to have the Android, that's going to be, I can't remember now, what's the latest one? Is it Swift or Objective-C? I can't remember which is the current thing, but
the answer is yes, because Swift is Objective-C.
Yeah. So you got to learn that. And that's a whole different language. Even though it looks a little similar to JavaScript, it isn't. So it's a whole different thing. And then if you want to go to virtual reality, now I got to go grab one of basically 2 engines, Unity or Unreal. And I've got to learn that, which is usually some version of C or Java or something like that, which is another dimension of technology that you have to learn to do. And the way that they approach things, the algorithms they use are very different things. Basic stuff like ifs and loops, yeah, they're all in there. But specifically data structures, like one uses an object and one uses an associative array, and another one uses a map, and the other one uses, and on down the line, learning all that makes it very difficult for any one team, much less a researcher, to move across those platforms easily. to just pick it up and go. There's been attempts at making technology like QT, I think, that's supposed to go across all of them, but they're all limited. And some of the applications, or I should say platforms, that are made to make that work with, for example, Esri's whatever developer thing, that's been discontinued, so it doesn't even exist anymore. So you can't really use that to do those things. So it's a daunting task to even entertain doing what you're talking about, just in terms of picking up the skills at sufficient quantities or levels to do what you're talking about, much less figuring out, well, how do I use the thing?
As people might evaluate, do I want to do this for my organization, my business, my agency, right? How do you sit down and evaluate what you're going to do? I mean, I'm on the ground trying to do it. And by the way, the other inspiration was is that I happened to see something about universal scene design and NVIDIA's Omniverse. All right, so I'm mentioning specifics, but you can see like just this flood of product names and things, and universal scene design is actually a standard. But I'm like, oh my gosh, am I behind the curve because this is, like they're saying, this is the amazing thing to go across all your software. And, that's the feeling you often get, right? It's like somehow I'm missing something as innovation is whizzing by my head, like, at 90 miles an hour. And like, oh my God, if I don't catch one of them, I will be left in the dust. And it must feel like that when you're trying to evaluate, like, how are you going to set up you have an idea that you want to do, and, how do I make it happen, or how do I get a team that makes it happen, or how do I decide if I'm going to contract it out, who can make it happen for me? And it's bewildering. And so I think that, I just thought it'd be great to just kind of talk about that a little bit.
My counterpoint, though, is in the platform you have chosen, Unity, you can export to WebGL, you can export to Android, you can export to iOS. You're going to need to do a little tinkering. But the fact that you're working in an environment, I believe Unreal works the same way, that you build your code base and then there's ways to export it out to other, besides what you started with, which is desktop. So
that's true. But however, then you go, I'm going to grab this piece over here and mix it in. Well, it turns out the thing you exported doesn't quite mix in exactly the way that you thought it would be. So you got to do a lot of duct taping things together, and it gets...
Yeah, but duct taping is better than starting from the ground for each and every one.
Yeah, we're definitely better today than we were 5 years ago, for example, or 3 years ago even. But the point is that it's still an ecosystem that is made up of like multiple shifting sands that have kind of linkages to each other, and it makes it challenging. And particularly if you're not doing this all day, every day, you may not quite realize exactly how much devil is in those details, and go, I can just do that. And then you get like down a trail, and then as you got this thing to do what you wanted to do, and the man hours that it took to do that, you go, okay, I got that to work. Now I got to make it work on this platform. You go, I just can't be bothered. So
yeah.
It's not, it is there, but it also is, it's a little bit like saying, all you have to do is write a dissertation. That's true, but it's not quite that simple usually. So
I will say that I have gone searching, and there are places like Stack Overflow, other places where there are matrices that go through just basically so that you can, flow things. So what might work together, or what have people tried? But there's nothing that's like a huge overarching, right now, this is up to date comparison that might make life easier. But there are places where you can find some comparisons people have made. But sometimes you wonder how much of this is commercially driven, rather than a step back and, reviewing these things.
It's even more maddening whenever the platform you picked, for example, if you use Esri as the harmonizing platform, which makes a lot of sense from a GIS geographer standpoint. Sometimes the functions don't behave exactly the same on this platform versus that platform. So you have to account for that sometimes. Anyway, that's just me grousing, but it's a lot more complicated than I think it ought to be. And it should be more holistically, in my opinion, it should be more holistically thought of, so that somebody like Sue can say, oh, I would like to explore going in this direction with this product. And you could, but it's, there are a lot of obstacle courses to go through to get there.
Yeah. And I think, some of them are things that most of us wouldn't even think of, right? I, for example, built something and I'm like, oh, this is amazing. It works cool. And then I shared it with someone who didn't have a computer with my particular qualities. And basically they said, wow, this thing looks horrible, runs horribly. And so just a simple thing in knowing, right, having the knowledge to know, for example, how many frames per second your visualization has to run in order to look good, right? And that's not necessarily something that you would automatically know. It depends on your background, but those are things that you have to learn. And that creates a challenge when you're trying to do things in this world where we have, as Jesse started off with, kind of contextualizing the two different ends of it. And so some very practical things just come into play. And again, I'm very excited when I see all the new things, and often on the podcast, I'll highlight stuff I think is really cool. But the nitty gritty of saying, wow, this might be something I need to pursue actually turns much murkier and a little bit tougher on the ground.
On to the events corner. Of course, if you'd like to find out more about these events, head out to them.
Intergeo 2023 is taking place October 10th through 12th in Berlin, Germany.
The Applied Geography Conference is going to be October 25th through the 28th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and abstracts are due coming up pretty quick, September 13th.
Thanks for the reminder.
And the first Go Geomatics event, which is going to be taking place in Calgary, it's going to bring together vendors, exhibitors, and people who are looking for careers in geomatics, will be taking place the 6th to the 8th of November. Of course, if you'd like us to add your event to the podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
I'm Frank, and I'm available at frank@veryspatial.com.
I'm Barb, and you can find me at barb@veryspatial.com.
I'm available at kindaspatial.com, and am I? I probably am.
I was going to say, I've never been to that, but now I'm going to look.
Yeah, well, I think it just points back to my jesserouse.com page. I'm available at kindaspatial, and of course, if you'd like to find all of our contact information, I will eventually update it.
As always,
we're the folks from VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
So it is like a beacon for me in all that we can see, the light that we can believe. So you see, a love that's lost to the deep. The dawn shines down on the sea. A ghost is all that